And then maybe you'd say, well, wait a minute, let's not just use university performance. Let's use junior high performance, high school performance, university performance, and job success. And then let's say that the only things that predict success across all of those categories and that are the same we're going to define as intelligence. Well, that's basically how you end up with IQ. You could say that IQ is what's common across all possible sets of intelligence tests. Now, people are going to debate that because you still have to define what constitutes a test. But the way the psychometricians have managed it and have taken care of this, at least to some degree, is to say, well, we're not going to define everything that we measure as intelligence. So extroverted people are more socially fluent. Are we going to call that intelligence? No. We're going to call that personality. We're going to call that extroversion. And we're going to call stress tolerance. You could say, well, if you can tolerate more stress, you're more intelligent. It's like, well, no, that isn't how we've defined it. We're going to define that as being lower in neuroticism. If you're cooperative, you're more intelligent. That's emotional intelligence. Well, what? You're less intelligent if you're competitive? Well, no. So we've parsed that off to agreeableness. So then the question might be, is there anything left of these so-called intelligences once you control for personality and IQ? And the answer is no. Nothing. Nothing left of them. And the people who keep pushing these ideas keep trying to push them because they don't like the idea of real individual differences. And to me, that's just a matter of sticking your damn head in the sand, because it's obvious. Here, you're going to have a child. You want the child to have an IQ of 65 or 145. Decide. Okay, so you're all going to vote. Okay, you think any one of you is going to vote to have a child with an IQ of 65. That child's going to have a hard time developing even linguistic ability. They're never going to learn to read, right? They're never going to leave home, in all likelihood. So which child are you going to pick? Well, so do you believe in intelligence or not? Well, obviously, if you have any sense.
So let's say we took off all the labels and we just, for every time something statistically came out as a 1,
yeah,
we just gave it a letter label, like A,
yeah.
B, C, D. So all these things just have their statistical validity and just names. So then if we're going to assign names to them after, are we assigning the names based on what we consider to be reasonable?
Okay, that's a good question. So look, here's one thing. So let's say this is actually what happened when people developed the Big Five. So I'm going to give a very large number of people every question, a huge set of questions that cover every element of their personality I can think of. It's agnostic, right? What I'm really trying to do is come up with the biggest possible set of descriptors that someone could actually fill out. That's a limit. I can't give you 10,000 questions. That's just, so maybe I'd take a set of 10,000 questions and randomly select a few sets of 100, right? Because then I would have represented the entire set. Then I give them to 1,000 people, agnostically. Then I do the factor analysis. Bang, 5 factors come out. And then the factor analysis tells me which questions load on each factor. And what the factor analysis is saying, here's 20 questions, and there's something about them that's the same. So then I read the questions and I think, well, those questions are referring to something the same. What is that? Well, then maybe I talk to 3 colleagues and we think, well, that's something like sociability. Bang, we have a name. And then we could go see, now that we have a measure of sociability, we could go associate it with other measures of sociability. Like we might say, well, are people who score high on this measure of sociability more likely to go to parties? And the answer would be yes. Because what happens if you take 10,000 questions about personality and randomly select sets of 100 and give each of them to 1,000 people and do a factor analysis, the first factor is extroversion. And it's the factor in human personality that seems to pick up the biggest amount of variance. And so then we say, from a statistical perspective, extroversion is real. But we define real. Real means that if you use linguistic representation, randomly applied across large sets of people, and you factor analyze it, these come out as clumped together. Because you have to define what constitutes real if you're going to play the this is real game, which is basically what you're doing in science. And so that's what happened with the Big Five. And then people started to look, well, okay, is there a biological substrate for this? Bang, it turns out there is. Incentive reward, that's the positive reward system. So, and then, well, neuroticism, that's often, but not always, the second factor. Well, is there a biological basis for it? Yes. Threat sensitivity and pain sensitivity, they seem to lock together. Agreeableness, that's the care system that Jaak Panksepp has identified. So that's basically maternality. It's something like that. You had another question.
There seems to be a difference in the way intelligence is measured in all these
Yeah.
People agreeing on linguistics, but intelligence is like an applied.
Well, it's because we found out how to measure intelligence. So, and I'll get into that right now. So then the question is, well, how do you measure intelligence? Okay, well, it's similar. It's similar to this linguistic approach, but here's how it differs. Generate 10,000 questions that require knowledge, and you get 50 people to do it, and have them be of diverse opinions about what constitutes knowledge. So much the better. Then you cover that. You want to oversample the territory. So you want to have some questions in there that only one person out of 50 would think that measures intelligence, because you can oversample. The statistics will take care of that. So you want to ask more questions than you think are reasonable. And that's part of the way that you get rid of bias in the sampling. It's like, you think, go find out 10 questions that someone could answer if you think they're intelligent. I don't care what they are. And then 50 of you do that. Bring me the questions. Well, let's say we get a nice set of 10,000 questions. Then we can take random sets of 100 and give them to 1,000 people. And then we can score their answers to the questions, and then we can rank order, we could say correlate their performance across different sets of questions. So I give you one set of 100 questions, you score 90. I give you another set of questions, you score, so 90 out of 100, you score 10 out of 100. Well, then we would think, if a bunch of people did that, those aren't measuring the same thing. Because if you're high on one, you should be high on all of them. Well, with IQ, it's like, if you do that, the reliability is like 0.9. It's unbelievable. You take one set of 100 questions, you rank order people. You take another set of 100 questions, you rank order people. You correlate the rank orders, it's like this. It's 0.9. The people who did well on one do well on all of them. The people who did bad on one do bad on all of them. That's IQ. Or more technically, this is what IQ is. Take 1,000 people and give them 20 tests of 100 items, and then factor analyze the 20 tests and extract out the central factor. That's G. That's fluid intelligence. So then what do you do with that? Well, then you can try to use it. Then you can see, well, is there a biological basis for this? Is there something about, if you're higher in the ability to operate across these sets of questions, are there things about you that are physiologically different? And the answer to that is yes. Your reaction time is faster. Just simple reaction time. So light turns on, you push a button. Light turns on, you push a button. Okay? There's a lag between the light going on and you pushing the button. The shorter the lag, the smarter you are. Well, what is it? And that's really interesting because, you know, if you're perceiving something complex, it takes a lot of neural connections to generate the perception. But simple reaction time is like 2 neurons. Whack. There's no complexity in that at all. And yet, how fast you are at that is still correlated, only at about 0.25, but that's not trivial. If you're doing research in psychology, generally speaking, and you come out with a 0.25 correlation between whatever you're measuring and whatever you're interested in, you're having a pretty good day. 0.25 is not bad at all. And so it's not accounting for all of it, but it's accounting for a fair bit of it. How big your head is, that's also correlated. How big your brain is physically, and then even more accurately, how big your brain is in relationship to your body. Now again, these are small correlations, but they're not non-significant. What else? Peripheral nerve conduction velocity, that's this study. 2 studies with sample sizes of 90 and 90, roughly speaking, are reported that investigated relationships among measures of intelligence, speed of information processing, and peripheral nerve conduction velocity. In both studies, neural conduction velocity was significantly correlated with IQ scores, 0.42 and 0.48. Man, that's a whopping correlation. How do I know that? Because a guy named Hemphill, where is he? Right there. You might say, well, how big is a correlation coefficient before you call it big? And the answer to that is, generally, let's guess. So if you talk to psychologists and they talk to you about how big effect sizes are, they used guesses that were generated by statisticians in the 50s. And so they radically underestimate the actual magnitude of correlation coefficients because they never studied it empirically. Well, this guy Hemphill, because how big is a correlation coefficient to be big? How do you answer that? Take 1,000 psychology studies, rank order the effect sizes, and break them into percentiles. Right? That's an empirical way of doing it. How big is the effect that the typical study generates? And then you can use that as a way of assessing how impressive the effect is that you generated. Okay, so this is it here. Hemphill, 2003, interpreting the magnitude of correlation coefficients. Now you could say that's a dopey way to do it because why define size in accordance with the size that people have discovered, and Hemphill would say, well, that's because I'm doing it this way with this paper. If you want to do it a different way, go right ahead. But there's utility in this. You come up with an R of 0.2. How likely is it that your next paper is going to have an effect size of that magnitude? How happy should you be? Well, the answer is a lot happier than you think. So to get an R of 0.5, that's 25% of the variance. So you still have 75% of what's ever explaining your phenomena left to be explained. R of 0.5, 90 to 97th percentile. So 19 out of 20 psychology studies that are published, and that's a hell of a lot fewer psychology studies than exist, right? Because a tiny fraction of them get published. 95% of them show a correlation coefficient of less than 0.5. For 0.35 to 0.50, that's greater than 75% of them. 0.15 to 0.35 is pretty typical. And the typical correlation between a personality trait and the target of interest is usually something in the neighborhood of 0.2 to 0.25. With IQ, you get up to 0.5. The relationship between income inequality and male homicide is like 0.75. It just covers all of it, which is to say that everywhere that everyone's poor, there's no male homicide. And everywhere that everyone's rich, there's no male homicide. But places where there's poor people and rich people, the male homicide rate goes way the hell up, right? Especially if it's a steep distribution, because the men at the bottom think, somebody has a lot more than me and that's not very fair. I'm going to do something about that. And that usually means killing other men. And so it's unbelievably powerful relationship. That's a useful thing to keep squirreled away in your imagination. Poverty does not cause crime. Relative poverty causes crime. That is a completely different thing. So, and it's dominance hierarchy issue fundamentally. It's men are generally the criminals. And as the dominance hierarchy gets harder to climb, the young men, especially the aggressive ones, get more likely to turn to violence. You really need to know that. It's an incredibly important fact. I'm going to interview the guy who figured that out, Martin Daly. I'm going to interview him for one of my podcasts in the next month or so. So you might be interested in tuning in on that if you're interested in this sort of thing. Okay, so back to these correlations. Look, peripheral nerve conduction velocity is correlated with IQ at like let's say 0.45. It's a whopping effect, man. And that's a pretty straightforward thing. Speed of electrical propagation along your neural tissue determines how intelligent you are. Well, is that really so surprising? You'd expect, if that's associated with neurological integrity, at least to some degree, it's exactly the sort of thing you'd expect. But it shows you how biologically based it is too. Faster neural conductance velocity was associated with higher IQ scores and faster speed of processing. Why? Who knows? Here's a hypothesis. If you're trying to remember a phone number, just the 7-digit one, what do you do when you're remembering the phone number? You say it over and over again, right? Or if you don't say it, you think it over and over again. And if someone distracts you, then you lose it. That's working memory, roughly speaking. And your working memory capacity, so imagine you could do 4 digits and remember them. You could do 6, you could do 8, you could do 12. Likely not. 12 is really pushing it. That's a great estimator of IQ, working memory. In fact, there's almost no neuropsychologists like to think that working memory is something in and of itself, but that's because they don't know a damn thing about psychometrics, generally speaking. There's almost no difference between fluid intelligence and working memory. And the reason for that is that all measures of intellectual function collapse into G. And so we can take a look at what that means. This is from this character here, Carroll, John Carroll. If you want to know everything there is to know about IQ, this is a book that everyone who's a psychologist you shouldn't be able to be a psychologist unless you've read this book, in my estimation. There's a couple of key texts, and this is one of them. This guy Carroll wrote this thick book. You don't have to read the whole thing because a lot of it's just, in some sense, demonstrations and proof of what he's saying. But what he did for IQ is the same thing that psychometricians did for the big 5. You've got the big 2 at the top. They're not very highly correlated. I think it's about 0.2, something like that. So they're pretty independent. And then they fragment into the big 5, and then you can differentiate them further into the big 10. And there really are 5 different traits because they're only correlated with each other at about 0.2 to 0.3. So they're really quite distinct. The question is, if you fractionate IQ, how correlated are the things that you fractionated into? And the answer to that is 0.8 or 0.9. There's one factor in IQ, roughly speaking. If you take, imagine that you took an IQ test and you took, it was 100 items long, and you took the 50 items that were the most correlated with each other, and then the 50 items that were the least correlated with those 50 items. So you broke it into two as much as you could. You maximally differentiated it. You might ask, well, how correlated would the scores be on those two different subsets? And the answer would be like 0.9. Because there isn't two things that you're measuring. Even if you break it up that way post hoc and say, well, it's unfair, but we're going to say because these are the 50 most highly correlated and these are the leftovers, like we're really capitalizing on chance there, you're still going to get an almost identical readout from both sections of the IQ test. And it's just not the same with personality. So this is Carroll's model, basically. Stratum 3, that's the highest level of abstraction, that's fluid intelligence. And then you can break it down into these subcategories of cognitive ability. And you might say, well, how different are those subcategories? And the answer is, not very. If you're high in one, you're very likely to be high in all of them. Now, there's a bit of a coda to that, which is that the lower your IQ, the higher the correlation between these sub-aspects of intelligence. The lower your IQ, the higher the correlation between the sub-aspects of intelligence. As you get up into the higher strata of IQ, your intelligence differentiates more across the potential range of differentiation. Which is to say, there's one way of not being very bright, but there's multiple ways of being bright. So, but even so, if you're high on one, you're still quite likely to be high on the rest of them. So then the question is, what's the correlation between G and each of these sub-elements of G? And then what's the correlation between the sub-elements of G themselves? So if this was plasticity, and we were looking at openness and extroversion, the correlation here would be about I think it's about 0.5, something like that. And the correlation between openness and extroversion would be about 0.3, quite a bit of difference. But with this, there's G, there's the sub-elements, there's the correlation coefficients, 0.9, almost 0.95, what is that, 6 or 8? 8, 0.8, 0.6, 0.8, 0.8, 0.9 pretty much, 0.9 pretty much. Well, you can fractionate it the best you possibly can. It doesn't matter. It's one thing. It's one thing. And it looks like it's the ability to abstractly represent and then to manipulate the abstractions. I said with working memory, you know, you can get it that simply. How many digits can you keep in your head simultaneously without dropping one? That's it. God. It's unbelievable. It's pretty straightforward. And then it's this viciously powerful predictor of long-term life success, probably a prediction of around 0.5. Now, psychologists hate this. They won't admit that it exists. And I think it's because there's something about intelligence that rubs against our intrinsic egalitarianism, right? There's two things that do it. First, let's say you're successful. You like to think, I'm successful, you know, and you like to attribute it to your own doing. And fair enough, you know, I'm not saying that there isn't an element of it that's your own doing, whatever that means. But if your nerve conductive velocity happens to be high, there's a lot more probability that you're going to be successful. And it's kind of hard to blame that on you or to attribute it to you for that matter. So it indicates a kind of statistical arbitrariness about the distribution of success and failure in our society. Okay, so that's one thing. People don't like that idea. The second thing is that it turns out to be very difficult to raise IQ. Now, it's tricky because it looks like you can raise IQ across whole populations because at least fluid intelligence looks like it's been rising quite substantially over the last 100 years. Maybe as people are better nourished and better educated, but also more prone to continually manipulate abstractions in their life. Because I mean, kids start with computers when they're like 2, you know. So, but if you take a group of people and if you take a group of low IQ people and you try to raise their IQ, it's very, very difficult to manage it without a tremendous amount of investment. That doesn't necessarily mean the investment isn't worthwhile, but it does mean that it's very difficult. Well, the best thing to do, as far as we can tell, the best thing to do is get the nourishment right. That seems to be the most effective. Yeah. So part of the reason that population IQs have been increasing over the last 100 years is because there's just no one left who's seriously enough malnourished so that it's going to profoundly impact their intellectual capabilities. So breastfeeding seems to raise IQ. So it's 2 points, 3 points with every year of breastfeeding. It's something like that. So and that's actually quite a lot. 2 or 3 points actually makes a difference, as it turns out. So, okay. So is IQ real? Depends what you mean by real. IQ is average performance across average sets of questions that require abstraction to conceive of and answer. Is it real? Well, it's real statistically, and you can use it to predict important outcomes that other things can't predict. And from a scientific perspective, and it's also correlated with various physiological and biological phenomena. Well, that's how you define real scientifically. So yes, it's real. Are there other factors that determine people's success and worth? IQ isn't a measure of people's worth in any intrinsic sense. It's an estimate of their ability to succeed in hierarchies that are dependent on the ability to manipulate complex sets of information. There's lots of other things about people that differentiate them in terms of quality and quantity and all of those things. And the most evident of those are the big 5 traits. Now, if you're a psychologist, and this is another thing every psychologist should be taught, if you want to discover something about human beings that hasn't already been discovered, the first thing you should do is make sure it isn't IQ and it isn't any of the big 5 traits. And psychologists almost never do that, because what happens is that if they control for IQ, so in a regression you'd say, okay, here's the thing I'm interested in predicting. The first thing we're going to do is add IQ. And not a measure that you took in 5 minutes either, like a real IQ test, because you want to use a good measure to test your hypothesis against. And not a 10-item measure of the big 5 either, like a 100-item measure, so you get a reliable measure. You throw in IQ, you throw in the big 5, and then you throw in your dopey construct. And then you see if it can predict anything. And the answer is no. And so psychologists don't do it, because whenever they do it properly, it destroys their construct. And that makes them irritated, because their claim to their position of authority in the educational dominance hierarchy is predicated on the validity of their construct. Now, if you're a real scientist, what you try to do is destroy your construct. You think, okay, it looks like this is real. Then you think, it's probably not. And I don't want to spend the next 10 years chasing a ghost and a chimera. So I'm going to try to destroy the damn thing. So you say, well, we'll match it up against a good measure of IQ and a comprehensive big 5. And it still survives. We'll do a couple of replications to make sure that we can't kill it any other way. And maybe we'll do the statistics 3 or 4 different ways to make sure that the thing just doesn't disappear when you use a different statistical procedure. And people don't do that, and that's why the replication rate, even among well-established psychological findings, so to speak, ones that have been highly cited, is extraordinarily low. And if you talk to psychologists, they'll wave their hands and they'll say, well, I don't really believe in IQ. It's like, okay, you know, we're not talking about, what do you call those? What did the Ghostbusters hunt down? We're not talking about paranormal phenomena. They're not things you get to believe in or not, right? There are rules for defining what constitutes something that's real from a scientific perspective and a psychometric perspective. So you don't get to say, well, I'll apply one definition of reality because I don't like IQ, and then I'll use the same definition to justify my own constructs. Like, sorry, that isn't how it works. You can do that if you're a postmodernist, you can do that. But if you're a person who actually thinks scientifically, you don't get to play that game. So, now, you know, part of the reason that we need to know about these sorts of things, let's see, how are we doing for time here? Oh yeah, we're doing good. I think we need to know these things partly because they have policy implications. First of all, you need to know them for your own life, because you got to know that there are differences in intelligence. It's really important. If you go into a job and you're not smart enough for that job, you're going to have one bloody miserable time. And you're going to make life wretched for the people around you because you won't be able to handle the position. And as you climb hierarchies of competence, the demand on fluid intelligence increases. And so, unless you want to fail, you don't put yourself in over your head. Well, what's over your head? Well, that's a tricky thing to figure out. I mean, you have to figure that out with intelligence, you have to figure it out with conscientiousness, you have to figure it out with creativity, you have to figure it out with stress tolerance. with agreeableness, because you want to go into a cooperative environment and not a competitive one if you're agreeable. And with neuroticism, you probably want to keep the stress level of your job relatively low, because those are all places that you can break down. And most people have at least one significant weakness in their intelligence personality makeup, and you got to be careful not to place yourself in a position where that's going to be a fatal flaw. But what you really want to do, as far as I can tell, if you want to maximize your chances for both success and let's say well-being, is you want to find a strata of occupation in which you would have an intelligence that would put you in the upper quartile. That's perfect. Then you're a big fish in a small pond. And you don't want to be the stupidest guy in the room. It's a bloody rough place to be. So, and you probably don't want to be the smartest guy in the room either, because what that probably means is you should be in a different room. Right? You should look at a place where if you're right at the top, you've mastered it. It's time to go somewhere where you're a little lower so that you've got something to climb up for. So, and if you're not hyper conscientious, for example, you're probably not going to want a job that you have to work 70 hours a week at, because you're just not wired up that way. You'd rather have some leisure, and like, more power to you. If that's how you're wired up, there's nothing wrong with having some leisure. But if you're someone who can't stand sitting around doing nothing ever, then maybe you can go into a job that's going to require you to work 75 hours a week. And almost all jobs that are at the top of complex dominance hierarchies require very high intelligence and insane levels of conscientiousness, as well, generally speaking, as pretty damn high levels of stress tolerance. You know, because that can knock you out too, because there's going to be sharp fluctuations in your career, generally speaking, at the higher levels of a structure, and you have to make very complicated decisions, often with very short time horizons. So you have to decide if that's what you want. Okay, so here's some IQ items. So this is from a test, roughly. It isn't from the direct test, but it's an analog of the Raven's progressive matrices. Now here's how the Raven's was derived. So imagine that you got your 100 questions, and you can take out the sum of those and call that IQ. Okay, so now you have a score. Then you can do a correlation between all of the items and that score, and you can find out which single item is the best predictor of the total score. Because you might see that question 39 has no correlation with the mean, with the average. You say, well, that isn't a very good question. You'd actually throw that out of the next test. But you'd say, well, item number 15 is correlated at 0.75 with the total score. So that's a good single item. So then imagine that you went across sets of IQ tests and you took out the best single item predictors of full-scale IQ. What you'd end up with is something like this. So the Raven's progressive matrices is a very good test of fluid intelligence. And it's relatively non-linguistic, which is also an advantage, right? Because imagine you wanted to assess the intelligence of a very diverse range of people, and they all came from different linguistic backgrounds. Well, as long as they can understand the instructions, which are almost self-evident, then they're going to be able to do this. Okay, so this is, you see, you have to guess, in case you didn't already figure this out, which you would have had you been using your intelligence and applying it, you're trying to replace the question mark with one of these. And so here's how you do it, roughly speaking. It's probably a working memory test, because you have to hold a variety of variables in imagination at the same time. Okay, so the first thing you see is every row has a star, a triangle, and a square. And each row has a dot, 2 dots, and 3 dots. And so every row has to have a triangle, square, and star, and 1, 2, or 3 dots. Okay, so this one, first of all, what's it missing in terms of shape? Triangle. Excellent. See, that's why you're at the U of T. And then, okay, and then what's it missing for dots? 2 dots. Excellent. So we do a little scan here and we see, oh, look, well, it could be that one, or it could be, that's it. It's that one. And so, is that right? Yes. Aren't we smart? No. That was easy. So no, you're not very smart if you figure that one out, because pretty much everybody can figure that one out. I think this next one is more difficult. Okay, so in the first row you see that there's 2 objects, each are different color, and they move together, right? They join. That one, they're separate there, they join, they're together. They're separate there, and they join there. So this one should be halfway in between those 2. And the other thing that happens is, let's see. This item actually might be incorrectly represented because the blue should be on the other side. Whatever. What's that? 3. Yes. Did they flip? Okay, well anyways, you see that it's 3. See, I'm not very bright because I've just lectured for an hour. Okay, so that was a more difficult item. And then this one is more difficult if I remember correctly. So, let's see. So they're all 3 different colors, so that has to be color. Then, what's the other thing? The relationship between the colors change. So, what's the answer? Ha, you're all scared to answer, aren't you? Because you might be wrong. Yeah. And the more anxious people are even less likely to answer. Number 3. Okay, so if you want to test someone's IQ, then you put together a nice batch of these at different levels of difficulty, and then you sum them, and then you rank order, and then you correct for age, and then you have IQ, and that's that. And then you can say, well, then you can sort people into the complexity of their occupations. And isn't that dismal and wretched? But it's true. So here you go. This is from the Wonderlic people. They're a commercial company that makes general cognitive ability tests, and it's often used by corporations, even though it's actually illegal. It's actually illegal to use IQ tests, but the Wonderlic doesn't promote themselves as testing IQ. I think it's general cognitive ability, which is the same thing, but whatever. The SATs, the GREs, the LSATs, all of those are IQ tests. So now they're more crystallized than fluid, and we'll get to that in a minute. But crystallized knowledge is what you accrue across time. So you could say that fluid intelligence is what programs your brain. It fills it with facts, let's say. It fills it with knowledge. But you can get an estimate of your intelligence by sampling your domain of factual knowledge. And the reason for that is that, well, obviously, the better the programmer, the better the content. And so what that also means is that you could, if your prefrontal cortex was damaged later in life, your fluid IQ could plummet, but your crystallized IQ remain more or less intact. So even though they're not different, one produces the other, and then once the producer has produced, then the producer can disappear, and you've still got the encoded knowledge. So at least that's how it looks to me. So, okay, so how smart do you have to be different things in life? Well, if you have an IQ of 116 to 130, which is 85th percentile and above, so it's 1 person in 8 up to 1 person in 130, I believe is 85, 90, 95, is it 95? I think it's 95. 1 person in 8 to 1 person in 20. Then you can be a attorney, a research analyst, an editor, an advertising manager, a chemist, an engineer, an executive manager, etc. Now, that's not the high end for IQ, by the way. You know, that it can go up. Well, it can go up indefinitely, although there's fewer and fewer people as it goes up. So if you want to be the best at what you're doing, bar none, then having an IQ of above 145 is a necessity, and maybe you're pushing 160 in some situations, and maybe that's making you 1 person in 10,000 or even 1 person in 100,000. And then also, to really be good at it, you probably have to be reasonably stress tolerant and also somewhat conscientious. So, you know, people, when you think, well, why is it that smart people are at the top of dominance hierarchies? And the answer to that, in part, is because they get there first, right? I mean, everything's a race, roughly speaking. And the faster you are, the more likely you are to be at the forefront of the pack. And intelligence, in large part, is speed. That's not all of it is. So if you're moving towards something difficult rapidly, the faster people are going to get there first. So IQ of 110 to 115. So that's 75th to 73rd to 85th percentile. Copywriter, accountant, manager, sales analyst, general manager, purchasing agent, registered nurse, sales account executive. If you look at universities, the smartest people they're above this. Who are the smartest people at university? What do you think? Mathematicians, physicists and mathematicians, right. I could tell you who's on the other end, but I won't. Yeah, I'd like to though. Anyways, okay. Going down now 103 to 108 is slightly above average, right? 60th to 70th percentile. Store manager, bookkeeper, credit clerk, lab tester, general sales, telephone sales, accounting clerk, computer operator, customer service rep, technician, clerk, typist. So you see at this level, people have some technical skill and some ability to deal with complex things. Okay, that's dead average. 100 is average. Dispatcher in a general office, police patrol officer, receptionist, cashier, general clerical, inside sales clerk, meter reader, printer, teller, data entry, electrical helper. 95th to 98. Machinist, food department manager, quality control checker, security guard, unskilled labor, maintenance, arc welder, die setter, mechanic. Good IQ range for relatively qualified tradespeople. 87 to 93. Messenger, factory production worker, assembler, food service worker, nurse's aide, warehouseman, custodian, janitor, material handler, packer. Now, what you're starting to see is that as you move down the hierarchy, the jobs get simpler. They're more likely to be assigned by other people, or they're repetitive. Because what IQ predicts to some degree is how rapidly you can learn something, but once you've learned it, it doesn't predict necessarily how well you do at it. And so the more repetitive jobs people with lower IQs are more suited to more repetitive jobs. Under 87, is there something? Well, no. Right. That's a big problem. And it's something our society has not addressed at all. Jobs for people with IQs of less than 85 are very, very rare. So what the hell are those people supposed to do? It's 15% of the population. What are they supposed to do? Well, we better figure it out, because one of the things that's happening too is that as the high IQ tech geeks get a hold of the world, the demand for cognitive power is increasing, not decreasing, right? You want to be a teller? Well, those checkout machines, they're not so simple. You want to work at McDonald's? You think that's a simple job? You don't see robots working at McDonald's. And the reason for that is that what McDonald's workers do is too complex for robots to do. So this is a discussion that no one wants to have, but that's okay. It's still a problem, and it has to be dealt with. So the US government, I think I told you this at one point already, it's illegal to induct anyone into the US Army if they have an IQ of less than 83, right? It's about 10% of the population. Because the US Army, and they've been doing IQ testing since IQ testing began, because they want everybody they can possibly get into the Army, because in peacetime, they use it as a way of moving people up the socioeconomic ladder, and in wartime, well, obviously, you need as many soldiers as you can get your hands on. And so you're not going to be any pickier than you have to be. So when the US Army says it's illegal to induct anybody into the armed forces if they have an IQ of less than 83, then you know that they've done it for absolute necessity. Right? And when people have made a finding that contradicts what they want to hear, and they're doing it out of absolute necessity, you can be reasonably true that it's one of those facts that just won't bloody well go away. And so you might think, well, if there's nothing for someone with an IQ of less than 83 to do in the Army, what makes you think that there's something that they can do in the general population? And then the issue is, because the conservatives will say, well, they should just work harder. It's like, sorry, that ain't going to fly. And the liberals will say, well, there's no difference between people anyhow, and you can just train people to do everything. And that's wrong. So they're both wrong, and they're seriously wrong. And the fact that neither side of the political perspective will take a good, cold, hard look at this problem means that we're going to increasingly have a structural problem in our societies, because we're complexifying everything so rapidly that you can't find employment unless you're intelligent. You guys are really going to face this, Lawyers are disappearing like mad. And the reason for that is, you can look it up online. Increasingly, you can do things yourself if you're smart. And so, like, the working class people have been wiped out pretty nicely over the last 30 years by automation and various other things. It's the low end of the white collar class that's coming up next. So I'm not saying that lawyers are in the low end, but low end lawyers are in the low end of the white collar class. So there's still going to be plenty of positions for people who are creative and fast on their feet and super smart. In fact, those people are going to have all the money, and that's already happening to a great degree. Because if you're smart and you can use a computer, you're so smart it's just absolutely unbelievable, right? And if you can't use a computer, and lots of people, and I don't mean, you can open Word. That isn't what I mean. I mean you can program, and if you can't program, well, you're right at the next end. So If you haven't got that with you, you're going to be left behind.
What's going to happen then when that happens, when you have...
Oh, a lot of them will take Demerol. That's what's happening in the United States. Yeah, it's an opiate. Yeah, so there's a massive drug problem emerging in...
Under 83 or whatever,
Yeah.
it's about 15% of the population.
Yeah, no, I'm telling you, that is what's happening. They're...
It seems like that percent of the population is going to increase.
Yes. Drugs. Yeah, drugs of abuse.
The population falling out of society.
Well, what is happening to a large degree is people drop out of the employment race. They get very depressed. They develop chronic pain problems, especially if they're men, because chronic pain and depression are very much the same thing. And then they subsist on opiates, which are subsidized by Medicaid in the US. I'm not kidding about this. This is exactly what's happening. What else is going to happen to people for whom there's nothing to do? They have a terrible time, especially if they're conscientious.
How large will that stratum of people grow?
That's a good question. You know, the AI guys are pushing hard on this. Hey, what's the biggest employment category? Driver. Think about it. What's Tesla doing? What are all the AI guys working on as fast as they possibly can? Driverless cars. No problem. Except that's the biggest employment category for men. So what are those guys going to do? Yeah, they're going to sit home and, you know, be miserable with their wives and take opiates because they have chronic pain problems. Right. Nasty. And you might think, well, could they think up something else to do? Well, if you have an IQ of 83 or less, you're not going to be doing a lot of thinking about something else to do. You know, that isn't how it works. Because you're more of a, you're an act person, not a thinking person, roughly speaking. You know, and so if you have a task at hand, especially if you're conscientious, you can diligently go about it. But, you know, I've tried to train people with IQs of 80 and less to do what I would consider tasks that one of you could learn to do in 10 minutes and never make a mistake again. And it's like tens of hours with bare minimum mastery of the tasks. So, yeah, it's an ugly situation, no doubt about it. Okay, openness. So, creativity. Well, I can talk more about this on Thursday. Maybe we'll just stop and I'll go into creativity on Thursday. So we've got about 5 minutes. So if anyone has a question, I'd be more than happy to entertain a question. So what I tell you, like what you need, we're in a technical area to some degree, right? So you need to understand how these tests come about because you can't understand the concepts without understanding it. So I'm hoping that the way I told you that the IQ tests were derived made sense. I mean, it's a fairly straightforward thing, but that's what you want to concentrate on. You had a question. Yeah, yeah. You can't train simple reaction time. It's really hard. You top out very rapidly. And but let's take your question a little further. So let's say IQ predicts how fast you'll master a video game. So then, and it does. So then let's say we're going to train the hell out of you on a video game so you get super good at it. And then you'll get like Tetris. You know, does everyone know what Tetris is? Okay, well Tetris is really an IQ test for all intents and purposes. It's a spatial rotation test. So you can get really good at Tetris, right? And you think, hey, my IQ's increasing. It's like, well, here's the problem. Let's say I produce a variant of Tetris that requires that the idea is basically the same, but it requires different operations. Being good at Tetris won't help you be good at that test. You don't get crossover. And people have been trying this for a long time. It's like, well, maybe you could practice a bunch of IQ tests and you'd get better. It's like, no, you get better on the IQ tests you practice, but you don't get